Hi, my name is Dr. Alfonso Siverls, and this is the first of a series of 3 videos on grief and bereavement. Um, I'm interested in this subject and actually got interested in it fairly recent. I mean, not because I was not familiar with grief. Uh, Let me give a little personal background. I spent over 25 years working in not-for-profit programs from the 70s into the 90s in East Harlem and South Bronx. That included a transitional living program for homeless people with AIDS, runaway and homeless youth, shelter and transitional living program, and a substance abuse program. And our substance abuse program was both residential and outpatient. And we ran it during the heroin epidemic, and that hit Harlem very hard. Uh, During the crack epidemic and during the AIDS epidemic. And we were very familiar with death and dying because many of the people who we helped and serviced died from AIDS because it was a high-risk population, especially in our AIDS program, dealing with homeless people with AIDS. So death was very familiar to us as service providers. In my personal life, I've had mother, father, brothers, sisters, aunts, all pass away. And I was able to deal with that. Of course, there was some extent of grieving, but was able to work through it. Almost 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, my daughter died. And that was different. The grief hit me in such a way that it was debilitating. Now, you have to understand that I was a person who prided himself on control, who understood my emotional makeup. I was a cognitive person. When I left the not-for-profit world, I was a professor. So, and I was a professor of psychology, so I thought I could handle the emotional aspect. But I was completely wrong with the death of my daughter. Grief became debilitating in ways in which I didn't realize was possible. I've dealt with people dying, but never so much with the after effect to the family of individuals that died. So, and how they dealt with and processed the grief, or how the grief created other problems until it hit me in a very, very personal way. And I got very interested in this issue of grief, looking at what is normal grieving versus what is abnormal grieving. To what extent is that determined by the culture? Does age play a role in it? Does the social support you have play a role in it? Does your individual fortitude and resilience play a role in the way an individual may grieve? And what is the right way to grieve? And how long should you grieve with the loss of a loved one? Now, bereavement and grief is almost like a natural process that occurs to any kind of loss that there was attachment to. And attachment is a very important concept in psychology, comes out of developmental psychology, that newborn, that infant attaches to the person that meets its needs, that provides for it, feeds the infant, changes the infant, on a regular basis, picks up and holds the infant. It's powerful. It's powerful. And I had social worker friends who used to tell me about, and they worked for child services, and in the rare cases, since we dealt with substance abuse, I had some interaction with them, and they were telling me how they had to go into families where children was abused and neglected, and you thought that that young kid would run into your arms happily to get away from the abuse of the parent. Now, we like to think of some mystical thing like this love thing, but it was the attachment. When that attachment bond is formed and held there, that they had to take those children from the abusive parents screaming and hollering. They didn't want to leave them. And why? The attachment was greater than the abuse, regardless of the type of abuse. So attachment is a powerful piece in our development and throughout our lives. You can almost think of it to some extent, the expression of it in some ways, this idea of love. And when we lose someone who we are attached to for a very long period of time, there's a void. There's a void. And bereavement may occur. And bereavement is the psychological, the physical, and the emotional response to loss, to individuals or events in which you have formed a strong attachment. All right? And that emotional response is grief. Grief. Grief is part of the bereavement, and it's the emotional response to loss, to either an individual or event in which you have formed a strong attachment. Now, how you grieve depends a lot on the culture and the society you're brought up in, but it also depends on your own individual, not only genetic makeup, but your own individual fortitude, your own individuality, how it's been shaped by your experiences. But we grieve. We can grieve not only over the loss due to death, we can grieve over other kinds of loss of a person in many forms in which there's that breakage of attachment. So grief is the emotional reaction to bereavement. Grief takes on the forms of a lot of emotions. It could be anxiety, guilt, depression. All of these emotions wrapped up in there is grief. All right, because grief basically is that emotional response to loss. So sometimes it becomes difficult to understand grief or separate that grief from anxiety, especially when you have situations of people who have grief and also something else going on, like post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, to understand and correctly diagnose what you're dealing with. We with your grief, we have to express it to some extent. There has to be a process of mourning, because mourning is the outward expression of grief. That's what makes funerals so important, because especially in this culture, and even more so in the African American community, we have a long history of placing a strong emphasis on funerals. And that goes back. We can trace that back to slavery, because the one thing that we try to have control over, the one thing slaves wanted, was to bury their dead. And we developed rituals and customs around it. If you're African American, you know how we do funerals. Prior to pandemic, funerals were a 2-day and sometimes a 3-day event. Sometimes I remember my grandmother's body being in one of my aunt's houses for 3 days prior to any kind of services. And we have these services in which we look at the life of the person. We express the whole person's experience. And our funerals are an arena of community support, all around helping people process grief and mourning, and paying tribute to that person and their life. So funerals were a very elaborate and important part of the African American experience. And we can trace that back to Africa, where the whole idea, you see, in funerals here, we may call it a going home ceremony, or we look at it as almost, leaving difficult times to something better. In Africa, we looked at it as joining the ancestors. All of this is sort of interrelated, interconnected. So funerals were very important. So you can imagine the impact that COVID had. Where funerals played a major role in mourning, and mourning is the outward expression of grief. And so the loss of these funerals, because we couldn't do it during COVID, how that impact people's ability to process and handle grief. But that's for a topic, another one of my episodes. But let me continue to talk about this thing of grief. Now, there's no right way to grieve. No right way. Very individualistic. It depends on your age. It depends on your culture and your society. It depends on your ethnicity and your group. All right? So there are many factors that has to do with the way people grieve. All right? So there's no one right way to grieve. And if you're a young person, well, adolescent, a younger child, you would grieve differently than an adult. Okay? And if you're a senior citizen, you may grieve differently than someone who's in their 20s and 30s. So there's factors that affect the way we express this, how we grieve and how we express our grief. Okay? But what is important to understand is that bereavement, that overall process, bereavement describes the emotional, the psychological, and the physical response to the loss of a person in which you have a strong attachment to. And that emotional component is grief. All right? And so, grief can be debilitating in many ways. It can be very debilitating. And I found that out through personal experiences. It can have physical effect. It can affect any of your body systems without you realizing that that's the cause of what's going on. It is unprocessed grief. All right? And in many ways, grief is physical. Because if it's emotional, and the emotions involved in grief is anxiety, depression, guilt, all these negative emotions are involved with grief. And that's directly related to activity in the brain, chemical activity in the brain on different areas and sections in the brain. So grief can affect the operation of the brain. And we know that to give you a quick example is that if you're close to someone and always feel good around that person, and that person makes you feel good, one of the things that's happening in your brain to feel good, or what you're going on chemically in your brain, is the release of certain chemicals or neurotransmitters, the sections of the brain that creates those good feelings. And when that person's gone, that process is not there no more. So grief can impact not only brain activity, it can impact activity of the nervous system. And that's for this next episode. What I'm doing is I'm doing a 3-part episode to help people better understand and deal with grief. And this is the foundation of a book that I am beginning to write on grief to help us understand it and process it. And it's so important in the African American community because one of the factors that make us at risk, that makes anyone at risk, is unexpected death. An unexpected death will create greater amount of grief. And we have a lot of homicide, police shooting, and unexpected death in the Black community. And we don't realize the psychological effect of all that. And not only that, we come from a history of enslavement. Enslavement. And enslavement where we were torn from families, told in the fields, whipped. A lot of grief. A lot of unprocessed grief. And could that alter the expressions of genes for this field we call epigenetics? And could that be passed down? And could that impact behavior today in terms of how quickly we respond to grief? Can that help explain why, percentage-wise, African Americans have a higher rate of what we call complicated grief than other ethnic groups? There's a lot of effects of slavery that's impacting our behavior today. And a lot of folks don't want to talk about that because they don't want to talk about that. But now, with the study and understanding of genetics, it's becoming clearer. All right, this is just an introduction to this idea of bereavement and grief to give you some idea what it is. And the next episode will be coming out very shortly, and that will talk about some of the physical, emotional, social, and psychological consequences of grief. I hope this has been helpful, and thank you for watching.